I followed the rules. That's the simplest way to say it. I listened. I learned. I adjusted. I did what was expected of me at every stage of my life, often before anyone even had to ask. I watched how approval worked, how disappointment formed, how people were rewarded or quietly dismissed. I took notes. Being right became my instinct. I didn't rebel. I didn't collapse. I didn't take risks that could be judged as irresponsible. I chose the safe answer, the mature answer, the one that wouldn't raise eyebrows or create unnecessary tension. People trusted me. They saw me as reliable, balanced, grounded. Someone who made sensible decisions and didn't complicate things with emotions or impulsive desires. I was proud of that reputation. It felt like proof that I was doing life correctly. What no one saw, and what I barely noticed myself, was how much effort it took to stay aligned with those expectations. How often I filtered my reactions before they surfaced. How instinctively I checked myself whenever something inside me wanted more or something different. I learned early that wanting too much was dangerous. It disappointed people. It created conflict. It made you look ungrateful. So I learned how to want quietly, or not at all. Every major decision in my life came with a checklist. Was it reasonable? Was it justified? Would it make sense to others? If the answer was yes, I went forward, even if something inside me hesitated. If the answer was no, I stepped back, even if something inside me felt alive. Over time, that hesitation became easier to ignore. I told myself that instincts mature into judgment. That desire is unreliable. That discipline is what separates adults from children. That narrative carried me far. From the outside, my life looked stable. Predictable. Built on solid ground. I didn't have dramatic failures or visible chaos. I moved forward steadily, collecting achievements that made sense and choices that could be explained. Inside, I felt increasingly distant. Not unhappy. Disconnected. I noticed it in small moments. Times when I should have felt excited, but didn't. When something good happened and my reaction felt delayed, almost intellectual. When people asked me how I felt and I answered accurately, but without resonance. I thought that was normal. I thought depth came later. I thought fulfillment was cumulative, that if I kept making the right choices, meaning would eventually appear as a reward. Instead, something else accumulated. Distance. I started to feel like a guest in my own life. Present, polite, appropriate, but not fully participating. I was doing what was expected of me, not what was emerging from me. The difference was subtle, but constant. I stopped asking myself certain questions because they didn't fit the structure I had built. What excites me? What feels true to me? What would I choose if no one was watching? Those questions felt childish. Self-indulgent. Dangerous. So I replaced them with better ones. What's the smartest move? What's the responsible option? What will keep things stable? Stability became my highest value. And stability, unchecked, can quietly suffocate everything else. I remember one evening that still lingers in my mind. Nothing remarkable happened. I was sitting alone, in a life that functioned exactly as planned, and I felt a sudden, sharp realization: if this is success, why do I feel so absent from it? That thought scared me more than failure ever had. Because failure at least would have meant I tried something that mattered. This felt like winning a game I didn't remember choosing to play. I looked at my life and saw that everything was correct, on paper, in conversations, in other people's eyes. But I couldn't feel myself in it. I had become very good at doing what made sense. I wasn't sure anymore how to recognize what felt true. And once you lose that distinction, you don't collapse. You continue. You function. You smile. And slowly, quietly, you begin to wonder whether living correctly is the same thing as living at all. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not loudly. Just enough to make one thought impossible to ignore: if I keep doing everything right, who exactly am I doing it for? Once that thought appeared: if I keep doing everything right, who exactly am I doing it for? I tried to treat it like noise. A temporary doubt. An overreaction. A phase. I told myself that everyone questions their life sometimes. That it didn't mean anything was actually wrong. That I just needed rest, perspective, maybe a change of pace. So I did what I always did. I adjusted. I optimized my routine. I added structure. I looked for ways to feel more balanced, without disrupting anything essential. I read about fulfillment, listened to advice, tried to intellectualize my way back into alignment. It didn't work. The more I reflected, the clearer something uncomfortable became. My life wasn't lacking success or stability, it was lacking me. I had built everything around external correctness. Around avoiding mistakes, minimizing regret, staying within acceptable boundaries. I had never built anything around internal resonance. I realized how rarely I asked myself simple questions. Do I like this? Does this energize me? Does this feel like my life? Those questions had no place in my decision-making process. They felt unreliable, subjective, even irresponsible. I trusted logic more than sensation. Explanation more than intuition. That trust had shaped me. I started tracing it back. I remembered how early I learned that approval was conditional. That being reasonable earned praise. That emotional clarity mattered less than emotional control. I had been rewarded for being easy, sensible, adaptable. So I adapted. I learned how to suppress impulses before they caused friction. How to reinterpret discomfort as immaturity. How to frame dissatisfaction as gratitude failure. Those skills made me competent. They also made me numb. I noticed how carefully I curated my reactions. Even alone, I monitored myself. I didn't allow strong responses, positive or negative, because strong responses complicate things. They demand action. They create consequences. So I lived in moderation. Moderate joy. Moderate ambition. Moderate attachment. From the outside, that looked healthy. From the inside, it felt muted. I realized I had confused emotional regulation with emotional absence. I thought being stable meant not wanting too much. I thought maturity meant flattening intensity until nothing felt urgent. That belief protected me from disappointment. It also protected me from feeling alive. There was a moment, quiet, almost embarrassing, when I felt it sharply. Someone asked me what I dreamed about when I was younger. Not as a challenge. Just curiosity. I searched my memory, and found mostly edits. Versions of dreams that had been adjusted to be practical. Acceptable. Realistic. Anything sharp or irrational had been trimmed away long ago. I couldn't remember the original shape of wanting. That scared me. Because it meant I hadn't just postponed myself. I had rewritten myself. I had become fluent in a language that explained my life perfectly, but that language had no words for longing, misalignment, or quiet grief. Everything had to be reasonable. Justifiable. Defensible. I began to see how lonely that was. Not socially, existentially. I had people around me. Conversations. Responsibilities. Interactions. But no one knew the version of me that hadn't been filtered through correctness, because I didn't know how to show that version without feeling wrong. I had learned to associate being right with being safe. Anything else felt risky. I realized then that my fear wasn't of failure. It was of being seen wanting something that didn't make sense. Wanting something that couldn't be defended with logic. Wanting something simply because it felt true. I had no practice with that. The idea of choosing based on feeling instead of correctness felt almost unethical, as if I would be betraying some unspoken contract with the world. As if I owed everyone continuity, predictability, reason. I didn't know how to disrupt that without collapsing the identity I had built. So I stayed still. But staying still felt heavier now. Because once you see the absence, you can't unsee it. I began to feel a subtle grief, not for something I had lost, but for something I had never allowed to exist. A version of myself that had always been postponed in favor of being right. That grief didn't ask for dramatic change. It asked for honesty. And honesty, I realized, was the one thing my correct life couldn't accommodate easily. Because honesty would require me to admit that following the rules hadn't brought me closer to myself. It had moved me further away. That realization cracked something open. Not enough to break everything, but enough to make one thing clear: if I didn't learn how to choose differently, not recklessly, not selfishly, but truthfully, I would continue living a life that functioned perfectly, without ever feeling like it belonged to me. I thought that once I understood what was missing, everything would collapse. That I would have to choose between burning my life down or staying trapped in it forever. Neither happened. What happened was quieter, and far more unsettling. I stayed. But I stopped being right. Not all at once. Not publicly. Not in ways that could be easily pointed out. I didn't quit everything or announce a transformation. I didn't suddenly follow impulses I didn't understand. I simply stopped correcting myself automatically. The first time I did it, I felt almost guilty. I let myself want something without immediately asking whether it was reasonable. I noticed an inner reaction and didn't rush to neutralize it. I allowed myself to feel disappointed without reframing it as gratitude. That felt wrong. As if I were violating a rule I had lived by my entire life. Nothing external punished me for it. The discomfort came from inside. I realized then how deeply I had internalized correctness, not as a guideline, but as a condition for existing comfortably. Being right wasn't just something I did. It was who I was allowed to be. Letting go of that identity felt like standing without armor. I didn't know how people would respond if I became less predictable, less reasonable, less explainable. Some noticed. Not with alarm, with confusion. I hesitated more. I answered differently. I didn't rush to agree or smooth things over. I allowed pauses. I allowed myself not to know. Most people adjusted. A few didn't. That hurt more than I expected. Because it showed me something I hadn't wanted to admit: some connections had been built on my reliability, not my presence. On my ability to make sense, not my ability to be real. Losing those connections felt like confirmation of my deepest fear, that being myself would cost me stability. But staying right had already cost me something far greater. My inner life. I began to understand that doing everything right had been a way to avoid responsibility for desire. As long as I followed the rules, I never had to answer the question of what I actually wanted. Correctness had protected me from choice. And choice is terrifying. Because choice means ownership. It means standing behind something without guarantees. It means accepting that your reasons may not convince anyone else, and choosing anyway. I practiced that in small ways. Choosing rest when productivity made more sense. Choosing honesty when silence would have been smoother. Choosing presence when distraction was available. None of those choices were dramatic. But together, they began to change how my life felt. I noticed moments when something inside me responded, not loudly, not euphorically, but with recognition. A quiet sense of "this fits." I had almost forgotten that feeling existed. I also noticed grief. Grief for the years I spent earning approval instead of building alignment. Grief for the self I had trained out of existence. Grief for the time I lost by believing that being correct was more important than being true. I didn't punish myself for that grief. Punishment had been my old language. This time, I let the grief inform me instead of define me. I realized then that I hadn't wasted my life. I had learned something difficult. I had learned how easy it is to confuse morality with self-erasure. How easily rules can replace listening. How subtly you can disappear while doing everything right. That knowledge didn't come cheap. But it came in time. I no longer aim to be right in the way I once did. I still care about responsibility. About impact. About integrity. But I no longer use those values to silence myself. I allow myself to be inconsistent. To change my mind. To want things that don't translate cleanly into logic. That doesn't make my life easier. It makes it mine. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself, the one who always chooses the sensible path, who minimizes desire in the name of maturity, who lives a life that looks correct but feels distant, I want you to hear this without judgment: you didn't do anything wrong. But you may have done everything instead of yourself. Living correctly is not the same as living honestly. And honesty doesn't require you to destroy your life, only to stop erasing yourself from it. I did everything right. And I lost myself. Finding myself again didn't come from rebellion or escape or reinvention. It came from one quiet decision, repeated over time, to stop asking whether my life made sense to others, and start asking whether it felt real to me. That question changed everything. Not overnight, but permanently. And that is how, after a lifetime of being right, I finally learned how to be present.